Hi, my name is Bey Logan, and welcome to the Hong Kong Legends DVD of Spooky Encounters, aka Encounter of the Spooky Kind, the Chinese title of which is Guai Da Guai, which literally means ghost fights ghost. Guai meaning ghost, and Da meaning fight or hit. So it's ghost fights ghost, and it's directed, written, and starring my all-time hero, Sammo Hung. Hong Kang Bo, his Mandarin name is Hon Chin Bao. And this movie has been rightfully described as a groundbreaking film because it combined elements of horror, comedy, and martial arts in probably the most successful package that has ever come out of Hong Kong action cinema. And I was talking about this film to Arthur Wong, who's a award-winning cameraman working on many, many movies like Once Upon a Time in China and Iron Monkey, Purple Storm. We were talking about this film, and he was saying the reaction of the public when it came out was really astounding. I mean, people had never really seen a film quite like this before. It's kind of an odd choice for a Christmas movie, but it was actually released December 24th, 1980, and went on, obviously it played on into the new year, and became the sixth highest grossing film of 1981. It earned like Hong Kong dollars 5.7 million at the local box office, and has done very well throughout Asia. It also screened to a decidedly mixed response at the Cannes Film Festival that year. And I remember, because I was living in England at the time, there was a magazine that I think still exists called Starburst. That's kind of a fantasy magazine. And at that time, the whole Hong Kong thing really hadn't hit. And now, of course, there's a huge crossover between the fantasy, science fiction, and comic book audience and the Hong Kong action fans. But at that time, there was not. And I remember being very surprised. They actually ran a still from Spooky Encounters. And a kind of derogatory comment. I think the thing was, horror fans didn't really get the comedy, and the film really wasn't bloody or gory enough for fans steeped in Western horror films. And martial arts fans didn't really appreciate that this was a film with some of the most superlative martial arts combat ever captured on film by Sammo Hung and his Hung group. That was good timing then as the credit came up for Sammo and his action team. And now we have, I guess, what is the equivalent of our James Bond opening, in that it's like a little sequence, it sets the tone, and actually has, it's a dream sequence with nothing literally to do with the rest of the film, except to establish the character of Courageous Chung, played by Sammo, who's this rather bumbling simpleton who has a reputation for being the bravest man in town, and so therefore finds himself cajoled into all these scary situations. And here we see exactly that, with these two burial urns colliding in midair. The burial urns, the traditional pot, was meant to contain the ashes and the bones after cremation of a Chinese person, but also the spirit would reside there as well, which is why you have a sequence there where the two urns were speaking to each other. This movie inspired many subsequent comedy, action, martial arts, horror films, among them Miracle Fighters, directed by Yuen Wo-ping. And they really played fast and loose with the running around. These burial urns were physically running around in that film. And the burial urn is one of the many different icons which you see, which are unique, I think, to the Hong Kong supernatural movie. And though this film is indeed groundbreaking, Sammo, like everybody, had influences that led him to make Spooky Encounters. And he himself cites the ghost stories that he and his fellow classmates would be told at the Peking Opera School by his instructors there. And these would be stories based on the folklore of southern China. And they were typical campfire tales that left quite an indelible impression on the young Sammo. Also, there had been in the past films, martial arts action pictures, which had elements of supernatural in them. Sammo himself had worked on King Hu's Touch of Zen, which very successfully brought in the idea that you could have a martial arts action film with a ghost element. That's also, Touch of Zen is one of the primary influences of Tsui Hark's later A Chinese Ghost Story. There was a lesser-known film called The Comet Strikes, which was directed by Lo Wei. It's a Golden Harvest film starring Nora Miao Ke-siu from the old Bruce Lee movies. And it's a swordplay film, but it's very atmospheric and has about it kind of the feel of a Hammer film done Hong Kong style. And Sammo was doing the action for the film, and also, if you look at that movie, some of the imagery is very similar to the imagery that he would use in his later comedy horror pictures. As ever in Hong Kong, where really credit is assigned almost at will, even though the film is directed, Lo Wei is the director of credit, I think Sammo actually had a lot of influence on The Comet Strikes, which is quite a hard film. As a film, it's quite hard to locate these days, but if you get the chance to take a look, I mean, it's quite a neat film for its era. It has been said that Spooky Encounters was the first martial arts action, a Hong Kong martial arts action, to show san da. San da meaning basically spirit boxing. San meaning spirit and da meaning fighting or hitting. So san da is like a traditional Chinese style of combat whereby the practitioner summons various spirits to give him supernaturally enhanced power in a fight. There had actually been an earlier film made at Shaw Brothers by Lau Garlong, Liu Chaliang, called Spirit Boxer, which was made in 1975. And this film had very similar elements to Spooky Encounters, though it was played slightly less for laughs than Sammo's movie is. I think the reason that probably Spiritual Boxer has not been more highly regarded is that, like all of the Shaw Brothers library, it really hasn't been seen widely since its release in the theatres. The films of the Shaw Brothers library films were never played on video, never really played on television. There's been like selective releases in America, and blurry videotape copies still circulate. But very few people have seen Spiritual Boxer, and as a result, Spooky Encounters, quite rightfully, has taken its place as being like the first film of this particular genre. Though I would say also, if we're crediting Lau Garlong, that Legend of the Seven Gold Vampires, which was a bona fide Hong Kong Hammer Films co-production, is another film that perhaps influenced Sammo in terms of bridging the gap between martial arts and horror. And here we are in the tea house. Sammo there, and on his immediate right is Yun Mo, one of his opera school brothers. Just drop that name in there before we move on here to our first supernatural sequence. And we're in a haunted house, and this is a real piece of Chinese folklore, which is if you go into a haunted house at midnight during Ghost Festival, and you go through this ritual of peeling an apple, if you can peel the whole apple, then the ghost will not come, and if you fail, then the ghost will materialize. In this case, through the mirror. It's worth pointing out that the whole film takes place during Guaiji, or Ghost Festival, because this obviously is not a holiday or an event that's observed elsewhere in the world, but I mean in China and in Hong Kong, during the 7th lunar month, which is normally August, there's a ceremony, there's a time of year called Ghost Festival, during which time the gates of hell will open and the spirits of the dead will walk the earth. And the interesting thing about the Hong Kong or the Chinese view of supernature compared to the attitude we have normally in the West is that in Hong Kong people genuinely believe that there are supernatural beings, that the supernatural is a very real force in their lives. And you see them during Ghost Festival burning paper money and offering prayers to the dead, and there are various rituals to be observed during that part of the year. So this film's set during that period, which is why Sammo's character, who's a carriage driver, has very little work because people are not going out on the streets because there are so many ghosts around. And so he has time to sit with his buddies and get cajoled into or tricked into undertaking these various challenges to prove that he is indeed, as he tells everybody, the bravest man in town. And here we have the old Abbott and Costello thing with the buddies actually providing fake ghosts, and subsequently the real supernatural presence making itself known in a few minutes' time. And when we see Sammo's close-up, I just want to mention one thing. The scar on that runs between Sammo's nose and mouth. Questions I always get asked: how did Bruce Lee die? How tall is Van Damme? Is Jackie Chan really do all his own stunts? And how did Sammo get that scar? And I think I've talked about it on previous DVDs, but I'll just mention it again now, that it's actually from a real street fight, and he had the end of a Coke bottle smashed into the broken end of a Coke bottle smashed into his face. And actually, if you look at it, it is actually circular. It's about the same size as the broken off end of a Coca-Cola bottle would be. So I don't know if that's an ad for a promotion for Coke or not. But that's how it happened. That's from the horse's mouth. There's Yun Mo, and this was actually a rare chance for him to show his comic abilities, because normally he's a very good acrobat and martial arts exponent. He plays the guy, the monkey fighting expert in Magnificent Butcher, and has a really cool fight sequence in that film. And he's normally a stuntman action coordinator. He's never really a leading man as such, and doesn't often do comedy. So this is like an unusual chance to see him spreading his wings a bit as an actor. At this particular time, Sammo was already a leading light at Golden Harvest. He'd established himself very early as a heavy in the films, as a bad guy, as a suitable opponent for various martial arts heroes of the day. And then he became an excellent choreographer and eventually an action director and then a director in his own right. And when he was casting films, he quickly put together a troupe of stuntmen and martial artists and character actors and worked with them again and again. And to a certain extent, if he's working in Hong Kong, he's still working with pretty much the same people. So you have all of the major lights of Hong Kong cinema have their own group around them, which is called like a ban, which is like a group. So you have Sammo is Sammo Hung, so his group is Hung Ga Ban. And Jackie Chan is Sing Long, so he has like Sing Ga Ban. Lau Ga Leung had like Lau Ga Ban. And so Sammo has like his Hung Ga Ban, and a lot of those people are still working with him to this day. We should talk a bit about the background to the film in terms of the supernatural and in terms of Taoism, which is the tradition from which a lot of the mythology that we see here is drawn. I myself, not a great expert on these matters, but so many Hong Kong films have elements reflecting Chinese folklore and Chinese culture that I think it's at least worth spelling out the ground rules. I mean, there really are three great traditions of thought in Chinese history, at least as far as they apply to the kind of films that we're watching here. There's Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Buddhism, though there's some question about this, is probably the thing that could more nearly be described as a religion, being as it does provide a set of ethics and a philosophy about what happens to you when you in this life and what happens to you in the next life. You also have Confucianism, which is really a set of practical values describing the responsibilities one has to the family and to the nation. And then you have Taoism, which is, for its era, for the age in which it was created, I guess it was kind of like a new age holistic system of thought, incorporating the supernatural, lifestyle, health, all different elements of living in and of the natural world. And the Taoist masters were actually the first advocates of feng shui, which is obviously very hip now in the US and elsewhere, which is a method of creating or laying out buildings and structures in such a way that they conform with certain rules of feng shui, which is literally means wind, feng, and shui means water, of wind and water. So the Taoist masters, of which there are actually two, a good Taoist master and an evil Taoist master, were in their day seen as experts on all kinds of different eclectic subjects, and also people potentially with supernatural powers. So we get to see in this movie, Sammo draws on that rich tradition, and it's primarily the Taoist tradition. This character here, Master Tam, is Sammo's employer in the film. He's played by this fellow called Ha Wong. And Ha Wong is a real-life martial arts expert, and he's been used in any number of films, but he's almost always the guy who's in a mismatch with the leading man. Even though he has some very good skills of his own, he's always the guy brought in to allow the hero to show off his superiority. And you can see him fighting Sammo in Odd Couple and The Victim, and he has a funny little martial arts duel with with Sam Hui in Private Eyes, which was action choreographed by Sammo. And he is this film, I think, probably gives him his best acting and action role, and so it is worth noting him, because you see him again and again, and he really is typecast as the guy that gets beaten in the first reel to show off the ability of the leading guy. And here we are at the everybody having their daofu, having their tofu. And again, I mean, the reference to certain customs, certain things that you should or should not do during the Ghost Festival, and these ghost stories setting up Sammo's character, because as he's told about the different occasions, that character Abi, Chan Wing Ai, the guy on the right there, who's an action choreographer of some renown, and his brother is Peter Chan Long, who plays the evil Taoist master in this movie. And I think Sammo is somebody who is constantly looking for both new concepts and new faces, new people to bring out in films. And in this movie, what he will do that's really interesting is find people who are known for in a certain tradition, a certain way, and try to reinterpret them on screen by giving them a role that's kind of against type. And later in the film, we see Lam Ching-ying, who was another opera school student, not from the same school as Sammo, but somebody who was respected as a practitioner of the Chinese opera. And Sammo really championed his career and was at this stage looking for a role that would really define him. And it gets half the way there because you've got Lam Ching-ying in a supernatural movie, but it was not until later in the film Mr. Vampire, Keung Si Sin-san, that Sammo actually cast Lam Ching-ying as a vampire buster, as like the Chinese version of Peter Cushing, which became the role with which he would be synonymous. And two wonderful character actors here enjoying a peep show outside of the home, Sammo's own apartment, their own home. So it's setting up the fact that he's the cuckolded husband. And this is something that is a recurring theme in Sammo's movies, that his character is tricked by the women in the movie, and eventually the women, that is, get their comeuppance. And you see something happening here which I guess is not a major breakthrough in terms of narrative construction, but certainly was interesting. In a few moments, Sammo, in his suspicion that his wife is being unfaithful, he discovers the shoe, and the shoe belongs to Master Tam, who is Sammo's boss, who's the guy who's fooling around behind Sammo's back. And the shoe actually has a key part to play in the very end of the film. So this sets it up, and Sammo is like carrying the shoe around for the whole movie, tied to his back, and you're wondering, what the heck, why on earth, why did we let the shoe go in the second reel, and then at the end it pays off. And if you look at the other movies of this era of the 1980s, it was really interesting to see Sammo looking at new ways to tell stories and new levels of storytelling in Hong Kong movies, because it has to be said that through the 70s and the 80s, a lot of the martial arts pictures were really a very thin, very basic, relatively poorly executed excuse for action. That's a nice shot. You see the blade next to the shoe, and it's obviously the shoe's the wrong size, and so he's going to carry it for the rest of the movie. And it's kind of the dark version of Cinderella. He has to find out the person. He has to find the person to whom the shoe belongs, to find out who's been sleeping with his wife. And I'm always asked about, and I'm talking about the things people always ask me about, is the way that women are always abused in Sammo's movies. And I'm not going to be an apologist for this. I mean, it's probably, I'm a huge admirer of his work. It's the element that I find the hardest to reconcile with him as a person. But his attitude and what he said to me is that he's an equal opportunity filmmaker, in that in his movies everybody gets abuse. I mean, men and women, children, dogs, cats, doesn't matter. And people select women and say, oh, it's terrible. It's like when people ask, why does Quentin Tarantino have violence in film? He just says, well, this is something that is an element of filmmaking, just like music and special effects. Here's Typo, who's a wonderful character actor, the guy with the glasses there. He's actually playing the role normally played by Dean Sheck. Well, Sek Dean, I guess Dean Sheck wasn't available for this movie, so Typo got to play this role of the guy with the little Fu Manchu goatee and the glasses. A little just side story about Typo. I mean, he's been in like everything from Enter the Dragon onwards. But a couple of years ago, I was involved with developing what was going to be like a Michelle Yeoh workout tape for Michelle Yeoh, and we had a big meeting with all of the people who were going to be involved with doing it. And I'm always amazed that Hong Kong, both physically and culturally, can sometimes really be an island. And there can be things that are happening in the big wide world, and particularly in the US, where you think everybody knows about this. And then you talk to Hong Kong people about it, and culturally there's really no crossover. And I remember a funny story sitting there and saying to everybody, well, it's going to be just like the thing Billy Blanks is doing. And they looked at me blankly, and I said, it's going to be like Tybo. And one of the guys who's a famous director, I won't say his name, he says, Tybo, you mean the character actor? And another guy says, you mean the subway station, the MTR station, because there's actually an MTR station called Tybo. So I really had to spend a bit of time backstorying and telling people, hey, there's this thing, and it's very popular in the States, and it's got nothing to do with this guy. But he's still around. He had a very nice acting role in a kind of an arty, dramatic Taiwanese film called Taxi that played at the last Cannes Film Festival. And there was like a colour flyer with a photograph of all the different actors involved with the film. And there he was. So he's still among us. And you can see him in that film. Here we introduce the most extreme and exotic form of Taoism known to man, and our bad Taoist master, Master Chin Hoi, who's played by Peter Chan-Long. And fans of Bruce Lee, of course, will be familiar with his work. He's was one of the main stunt players on Bruce Lee's stunt team. You probably, in terms of an acting role, you can see him most prominently as one of the two Japanese fighters who gets to eat glass in Fist of Fury. I mean, he's the guy with the big hair who gets beat up at the beginning. His nickname is Mao Gu, which means unfortunate. And he's a fine character actor, and like many people in Hong Kong films, he's had this really long career. I mean, you see him in Fist of Fury, and then he was in Prodigal Son. He plays like this kind of goofy-toothed, bumbling sidekick to Yuen Biu, and he plays almost the same character opposite Jet Li, Lei Ling-gi, years later in Fong Sai-yuk. So he's typical of the career arc of Hong Kong actors who seem to be around forever. The last movie I remember seeing him in was a movie called The Mad Stylist, which came out in 1997, and it was a movie starring Michael Wong, and it was like a modern remake, a Hong Kong remake of Sweeney Todd. It was about this barber who's killing people, and I remember, for my sins, I had to write the advertising copy for the poster for Mad Stylist, and I think we had the first cut as the deepest was the one that we ended up using. A quick mention of the other guy here, Chin Tsoi, played by Cheung Fat, who's like the good wizard in the movie. This, I think, is his career best performance as this eccentric but benevolent Taoist master. Kind of a bit of a stretch to say that these two are brothers. But actually, if you look at Chan Long and you look at his real brother, Abi, who we saw earlier in the film, they look about as much alike as Chan Long and Cheung Fat. So I guess it's truth is stranger than fiction. On the right is Wu Ma, another key player in Sammo's team. He was he's a director. Poor bugger, directed me in the movie Circus Kids, and so I've worked with him. He was a student of Shaw Brothers veteran Chung Chit, and he directed a film called Dead and the Deadly. He acted in and directed that movie, which Sammo produced, which was very much in the style of Spooky Encounters. And he also is still around. I mean, his face as he got older, I think I was writing about him one day, I said that he has this wonderful face that's reminiscent of an apple left to wrinkle in the hot sun, and it's like he's like that as he gets older. His face has a great character. I don't know that he necessarily was ever one of the greatest directors in Hong Kong cinema, but he's always been working, and he's certainly one of the greatest character actors. I mean, you may remember him in Prodigal Son. He has this wonderful big red nose, and he plays this guy with a fake iron fist who goes to challenge Yuen Biu. But he is prolific, and I mean, not a screen fighter. Though actually he did have one movie called Manchu Boxer, which starred Lau Wing, Tony Lau, from the Bruce Lee movies, and they tried to launch him as a martial arts star in his own right. And the first scene of the movie, we see him fighting a Manchu lord, and the Manchu lord is played by Wu Ma, and that's actually one of the few times that I've seen him fight. The movie I did with him, his character was meant to fight, but it was almost always a double, as indeed it was when I was fighting. So it was like, as it was when Donnie Yen was fighting. So Circus Kids was like, where doubles dare. And here we have the introduction of Cheung Fat's character. I really like his role here because even though he's a good guy, he's really... somebody said to me once that a lot of the time, anybody who practices sanda or ghost boxing for any serious period of time, their character does become kind of weird. And this is obviously played out here by his character. And it's not as over the top as you see many kind of oddball characters in Hong Kong films, but there's something really not quite right with his reactions and the way he's talking and the way he's reacting to the world around him. And I think it's really nicely judged performance. He's a terrific martial arts exponent. He also was an opera student, again, not from Yu Jim Yun, the master of Jackie Chan and Sammo Hung. I think he was also with Fan Fot Fa, who was a female opera master, and she was the instructor of Lam Ching Ying. And you can see him. He has a great fight with Sammo and Magnificent Butcher, playing this guy, Crazy Cat. He has like a cat style. And he also had a nice role in one of Ronnie Yu's early films, The Trail, which another one of these movies made at Golden Harvest that kind of followed in the Spooky Encounters vein of matching martial arts and horror together and comedy together. And again, great longevity. He was, you can see him. He's one of the opponent, the guy with the mustache and the combat gear who fights Michelle Yeoh at the end of Yes, Madam. And if we go back to the beginning of his career, he was in Enter the Dragon. He's one of the guards, who gets beaten up by one of the guards who must prove themselves worthy to remain among us. And he gets beaten up. He gets killed by Bolo. And years later, he would be, in this movie, he plays somebody who has a genuine skill in spirit boxing and sanda. And years later, he's in Last Hero of China with Jet Li. At the very beginning, there's like 3 sanda masters who fight Jet Li, and he's one of them. And I think one of the other ones is Ha Wong. But in that case, they're kind of fake. And there's always been like different takes on spirit boxing. It's either been played straight, and as it is in this film, that's a genuine phenomenon. It can actually enhance somebody's physical prowess. Or in films like Ninja in the Dragon's Den, Once Upon a Time in China 2, much is made of the fact that it's fake and that the real martial arts master has the skill to defeat the charlatans. I should mention that the money you saw changing hands just then was hell money. And there's a custom in China that when somebody dies, you basically burn things for them to enjoy in the next life. And obviously Chinese people are very practical, so they don't burn real money and real cars and real TV sets and all these wonderful luxury items, but they have replicas made, and their hell money is basically denominations in thousands and millions of dollars with the King of Hell written on the money. And you burn that, and this is actually money that they can spend in the next life. So it's part of the whole ritual of helping your relatives, your loved ones, to have a better time when they're in the next life, and also a better rebirth in the future when they come back into this world. All part of the complicated cosmology of Chinese culture. Now, Sammo, having established this horror comedy genre to the level that he did with Spooky Encounters, returned to the material later more as a producer than as a director. Maybe he felt that it would be hard for him to capture the same success that he had had with Spooky Encounters, and so he produced Dead and the Deadly, which Wu Ma directed, and he produced the Mr. Vampire series, of which the first film is very much the best, which was directed by Ricky Lau and starred Lam Ching-ying. He produced Hocus Pocus, Spooky Spooky, and it wasn't until 1989, which is like almost 10 years later, that he directed an official sequel to Spooky Encounters, which was called Spooky Encounters 2, or Guai Sat Guai, which means Ghost Kills Ghost. And even though that film does have merit, I mean, it really is not as anywhere near as memorable as the first film. So maybe Sammo was right to hold off for as long as he did. And here we see our first clear view of a Taoist ritual and the altar, which is very important in the practice of Taoism. And if you use the wonderful DVD freeze frame, you can look at it in some detail and see that the elements there are like a lamp. There's 2 candles burning, and they have bowls of tea and sticky rice and water. And one of the tenets of Taoism is that there's a balance in all things between yin and yang, which is like the light and dark, male and female, hot and cold, angry and passive, and that the best result in life is when you have an accord between the 2 elements. And so on the altar, the bowl of tea represents the yin element, and the water the yang, and the sticky rice apparently represents the union of these 2 energies. You also have incense, or hung, which is being burnt, which is a common element you see throughout any tradition of China, of any of the kind of esoteric traditions, the burning of incense. And you normally burn incense in 3s, 3 being an important number: heaven, earth, and man. And you have weapons, among them various swords. Here you see Chanlong's holding a wooden sword with various ideograms, and the paper, the yellow paper that's on the end of it, is called a fu, which is a special parchment onto which magic is written, magic characters are written, and these can invoke all kinds of reactions. And they're most normally seen in this kind of movie on the forehead of a hopping vampire, or a kengsi, which is a kind of a unique interpretation of the vampire myth that we see in Chinese horror movies, martial arts action horror films. And it's obvious when Sammo set about researching the film and working on the movie with his normal, thorough approach. He brought in genuine Taoist masters, feng shui masters, masters of this kind of sanda practice, and asked them to instruct him and the set decorator and the production designer to make sure that everything really conformed to the way that Taoism was actually practiced in the real world. And again, I keep coming back to this, that even in this age of the internet and computers and people landing on the moon and all the other wonderful phenomena of this new century, is that I find from living in Hong Kong that Hong Kong people at heart remain very Chinese and very superstitious. And they genuinely believe that the elements, the things that we see in this film, not only that they, even if they don't exist today, that they did exist at one time in Chinese history and may still exist in some very remote part of China or elsewhere in Asia. And I don't know if in the West, if you look at our comparative myth, like the vampires and the mummies and all these other things, that there's a same belief by people that this is something that's really there. I think people now increasingly dismiss old legends as folklore, as like primitive interpretations of natural phenomenon. But in the East, I don't see that at all. I see people genuinely, friends of mine, who you would really think would, not to be condescending, but you think they would know better. But they say, no, this is something that really exists, and you make fun of it at your peril. And certainly whenever they make these films in Hong Kong, there are certain rituals that are undertaken in terms of having a blessing on the set and following certain procedures, and they don't take it lightly. I mean, one movie I would say in the West where there certainly was taken very seriously at the time that it was made and has had the same quality of legend about it would be The Exorcist, where apparently there was various strange phenomenon happening. And here we have our first view in a Hong Kong martial arts movie of this era anyway, of the Kung-si, or their version of the vampire. And I'm always people are always asking about why the Hong Kong vampires really look the way they do, why they dress like that. Well, most dead bodies, or dead people, were dressed in the most extravagant clothing available. So that even if the person was not a courtier or a rich man or a mandarin in their real life, when they were reincarnated, they would be reincarnated to a better destiny, and they'd have a prosperous time in hell. So here you see, as with many of the vampires that we see in Hong Kong action films, this corpse is dressed in very nice robes, which have obviously decayed from the time that they've been in their coffin. And you notice the coffin shape for Hong Kong coffins or Chinese coffins is very different to that we see in the West. And it's really meant to imply a seed which is being laid into the ground towards the time of the rebirth of the deceased person. So the vampires the vampire basically is the use of the word vampire is misleading, because I don't know that blood sucking is necessarily a key element here. And when in the West we talk about vampires, we're really talking about Count Dracula and people drinking blood. I think this is really nearer to what we would call a zombie, which is a reanimated corpse. And again, this is something that people genuinely believe, that in remote places in China, the dead body would be reanimated by virtue of having a parchment or a fu attached to it, and that then it would be transported from one place to another. And the reason that you'd need to transport the corpse is because traditionally, to ensure benefits for the surviving family, a dead person had to be buried in their hometown, and there had to be certain rituals performed to appease his or her spirit. So if the person happened to die in a distant place, I suppose it was difficult to transport the person back. So they used to, in the films you see this, in Mr. Vampire you see it, these Taoist masters ringing a bell to lead these hopping vampires from place to place. And the reason that they hop and the way that the limbs are so stiff is because, of course, having been dead for some period of time, rigor mortis has set in. And even though probably it was not described in those terms, and maybe in Chinese medicine there was a different term for that phenomenon of the body's muscles tightening up after death, they certainly were familiar with it. And so there was the logic that if a body was reanimated, having been dead for a period of time, it would not have the normal bending in the joints that you have from a real live person. And then we have a good example of the stiffness that set in. And it lends itself to a lot of comedy because you often see the ghost hopping along. It cannot go over the relatively low threshold of a door. If there's like a ledge there, they couldn't hop over because they couldn't hop to any great height. You actually had seen these versions of these zombies in earlier films, very old black and white movies, in fact. There's a film called Moving Corpse in the Old House, which was made in 1939. And in 1957, there was a movie called The Corpse Drivers of Jiangshi, which really referred back to this old legend in the style of those films at that time. There was actually one of the Wong Fei-hung film series, which was going to be Wong Fei-hung and the Mystery of the Haunted House. Apparently, it was never completed, but had it been finished, it was going to you would have seen the martial arts master Wong Fei-hung, as played by the late great Quan Ta-hing, would have been fighting with zombies. But the film never completed, and I guess the footage is lost to time, as in fact many of the films are in the Wong Fei-hung film series. And here's the increasingly acrobatic zombie, and Sammo naturally terrified. And this whole thing of a remote control of a wizard controlling a third party by remote control is a recurring image that you see in films. You saw that in Spiritual Box, the Lao Garlong film, and he also used the same thing in martial arts of The Legendary Weapons of Shaolin, which is another film which shows the clash between experts of the spiritual boxing and masters of real life martial arts fighting. And obviously, in this instance, we see the zombie doesn't only have the power to hop along, but even though its body must stay absolutely straight, because it's supernaturally enhanced, it has limited power of flight as well. The dawn is about to break, and I think it's a truism of supernatural beings around the world that at daybreak they must return to their coffin or to their native soil. And I guess it's true, the fact that there are many people like myself. By day we don't believe in ghosts, but by night, if you're alone in a spooky house or if you're in the graveyard, you start questioning what you believe in and what you don't believe in. And most myths, I think, were created around the campfire, where people were scared of the dark beyond the ring of the flame. And the coming of the dawn meant that the fears would die away. So you have a theme that all manner of creatures, the Western European vampire being foremost among them, by daylight cannot survive. So they're creatures, literally creatures of the night. And there's really a kind of this plot point is kind of deus ex machina, that you have Wu Ma turns up and Sammo, courageous Zheng, is in such a state of shock that he agrees to a second night in the haunted house. And evidently, anybody who'd been through the experience that Sammo has done would not go back there for any money. And of course, that's a recurring problem you have with horror movies, is that if people actually behave sensibly and at the first sign of something supernatural head for the hills, like any of us would do, you don't have a movie. So this was something I think that they played up in Scream and all these other films that are kind of making fun of horror movies, is the fact that people have to behave in a really illogical and stupid manner for even to have a horror movie. Here we introduce another of the unique aspects of the Chinese supernatural, is that these chicken eggs thrown at a vampire it's one of the weapons that you can use. It's like the equivalent of garlic. And here you see this rather unscrupulous guy runs out of chicken eggs, and he puts duck eggs in instead. And of course, duck eggs don't have the same effect. But he doesn't know that Sammo's going to be using these to fight vampires. I guess he thinks he's going to make breakfast. So it's not such a big deal. You see the same thing happening in Mr. Vampire. Another weapon that can be used against vampires is sticky rice. But regular rice will not work. And the same thing happens, that the guy runs out of sticky rice and gives the guy regular rice as well, mixes it together so that you don't really have the full force. And a few moments ago, you saw Sammo turning over to a butcher's shop with a black puppy. And I'm sorry to say that another weapon that can be used against supernatural beings is the blood of a black dog. And the dog has to be black. So Sammo's taking this poor beast there And unfortunately, in these unenlightened times, I have to say, you get the thing at the end of Hollywood movies, we guarantee that no animal was hurt during the making of this film. Unfortunately, this time in Hong Kong, people were like, we guarantee that animals and probably stuntmen were hurt during the making of this movie. And again, I'm not going to be an apologist for the culture of Hong Kong, but the reality is that animals have had a pretty rough shake of it. I mean, in southern China, all manner of animal was good for the pot. Dogs and cats could be cooked, and snakes and all manner of creatures. And and in the films, I mean, in Snake in the Eagle's Shadow, you had the famous scene when they had a cat really fighting with a snake, which is something I think you wouldn't, obviously, evidently and rightly, would not be allowed in a Hollywood production. And later in this movie, we see a chicken, which unfortunately, whose time has come. You have to bear in mind that many times in Chinese households, children's growing up, they would buy a chicken at the beginning of the week and fatten it up, and then it would be killed. The kids themselves would be given a chopper and said, "Go out and kill the chicken, sonny." So it was really no big deal for a fowl to meet its end. So now we have this scene where this poor chicken gives its life in the name of entertainment, because another element of that's exactly the same reaction I'm having here, by the way. But the another element of the Taoist ritual is the chicken blood, and the chicken has to be killed in a certain way for the blood to be effective. So it's rather similar to kosher, which is obviously the Jewish tradition, whereby meat has to be prepared in a certain way. If you're practicing Jew, the meat has to be prepared in a certain way, and the same in Islam and various other traditions. So obviously, all of these, there seems to be worldwide certain social conventions, among them that there has to be a manner in which meat is prepared, or in this case, in which the chicken is killed, to add further power to the already awesome hopping abilities of the vampire. So Sammo now is back in the haunted house with his bag of tricks, which he hopes will keep him safe. And so I should talk a bit about hopping vampires, because there was an occasion when a hopping vampire saved my bacon, and I wasn't engaged in a kung fu fight at the time. But a few years ago, I was invited to give a lecture to the Asia Society, and they're a very highfalutin bunch, based in the States and in Hong Kong and in Asia, as the name suggests. I believe that the Asia Society was founded by Woodrow Wilson. It could have been Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know. It was an American president anyway, and it was set up to promote better understanding between East and West. And they decided to have a lecture about Hong Kong film, and for whatever reason invited me to give it 2 lectures. The first one was going to be about martial arts and swordplay movies, which is really my forte, so I had no problems doing this. But they also wanted me to talk about the other genres of Hong Kong filmmaking, namely drama, horror, and comedy. So the second one, I really had to pull one out of the bag to entertain these folks, all of whom were very highly educated and wealthy Hong Kong people. And I had to come in and say, today we're going to have drama, horror, and comedy, much like my wedding night. And to my horror, the drama died an absolute death. And I had thought that these people would really be interested in the dramatic scenes from films like, All About Our Long, and these films, The Moment of Romance, all the dramatic stuff from films that I had chosen. Then I realized to my cost that really dramatic scenes really do not work outside of the context of the film in which they take place. So if you take a dramatic sequence and show it just as an example of good acting, it falls flat, as indeed all the scenes fell flat. So I was getting my flop sweat and was about to head out the back, and I thought, okay, well I'll steamroll through the horror as fast as I can and get to the comedy, because I was leading into the comedy with this great sequence that incidentally was choreographed by Sammo, which is the fight in the kitchen from Private Eyes with Michael Hoy fighting with this other guy. And I thought, well, this is, by the time I get to the comedy's universal, it'll really work. And this scene came on in the horror section, which I was just steaming through to get to the comedy. And these people were diving out of their seats. They were jumping up and down with glee. And these are like bankers and stockbrokers and doctors and lawyers. And it really taught me a lesson, which is that you don't know what the audience wants. The audience will tell you. And I love this sequence anyway. I mean, I love it because I love martial arts movies, and I love the fact that Sammo structured this great scene here with a fight between himself and this poor stuntman. I mean, you got to feel for the guy. I mean, it's tough enough if you're wearing loose-fitting clothes like Sammo is to be performing an action sequence, but to be constrained as he is really quite something. And this is the first time in the movie we really get to see the acrobatic skills of Sammo Hung. And a lot of people, when they were watching the film in the Asia Society, were like, who's this guy? And I said, well, he's in martial law. And this is the first time that he actually worked with a reanimated zombie. Second time was probably when they cast Arsenio Hall. But it was an amazing sequence, and definitely played well with the Asia Society. And I've always thought since then, I'm kind of surprised that nobody yet in terms of doing an international the fact that now people are constantly raiding older Hong Kong movies to find sequences for American actioners, that no one's actually brought over a hopping zombie into an American picture, because I think it would work really well. And there was actually a plan. Golden Harvest, after the success of Mr. Vampire, decided that they wanted to do an English version of Mr. Vampire, which was going to be produced by David Chan, and it was called Demon Hunters, and it was going to star, I think his name is Jack Scalia, guy who was in Dallas, and Michelle Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas. And for a long time, people said, it was Lam Ching-ying who was in the film, because what happened was they actually shot a few weeks and then they abandoned the production. One of the very few times that Golden Harvest has ever done that. But they shot like a couple of weeks and they decided that it wasn't working, so they cut their losses and the film was never finished. But actually, Lam Ching-ying, who had been the titular character of Mr. Vampire in the Mr. Vampire films, was apparently unavailable at that time. So it actually was Yuen Wah who was playing the role. And somebody had said to me that because Lam Ching-ying had not got along with when people thought it was Lam Ching-ying that had played the part, that he did not get along with the Western actors, and that it had been the film had been abandoned, that he had a thing, that he had a bias against Westerners. And I can definitely say that, from my own experience of him, fortunately I interviewed him about a year before he passed away. Definitely wasn't the case, and it wasn't even him in the film. So this is another case of how a story can become part of the modern mythology of Hong Kong film. And this is one of the reasons that I'm happy that we can do commentaries and talk about the films on these DVDs. By the way, I could mention it, Chan Leong is trussed up almost exactly the same as Jackie Chan is at the end of The Young Master, which was his first film at Golden Harvest, and that last sequence, and it's so exactly the same. And there's constantly this back and forward of this rivalry of ideas between Jackie and Sammo. So I don't know whether that's coincidental or not, but it's certainly a little fun visual reference. But as I say, it's nice to set the record straight on some issues and probably create controversy on some others. Quick mention of the woman playing Sammo's wife. The actress's name is Leung Sut-moy. And she just was a character player at Golden Harvest at that time. And during this era, like the late 70s and the early 80s, the balance of power had shifted away from leading ladies and towards leading men. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, it was really the era when people like Su Fong Fong and Fung Bo Bo and all these different female actors were doing their Jane Bond, the female James Bond movies. And it was unusual to have... Normally the men were in secondary roles, either as the boyfriend or as the bad guy. And the women kind of ruled the roost. Here in the 70s and 80s, you really had the leading men coming into their own. And the women generally were just given thankless roles as wife, girlfriend, the flower vase in the corner. And this all changed. This is probably why Yes, Madam had so much impact when that film came out, because Michelle Yeoh established a new revival of the woman warrior who had kind of fallen from grace during this particular era. Here's the late, great Lam Ching-ying. Lam Ching-ying was a student of Madame Fan Fot Fa in the Chinese opera, and because of his slight build, he specialized in female roles, and you can actually see him playing in the movie Painted Faces, which is supposedly the story of the experiences of Jackie and Sammo and Yuen Bu and the others at their opera school under Sifu Yu Jim-yun. And in the film, he actually plays an opera buddy of Yu Jim-yun, who's played in Painted Faces by Sammo Hung. So Sammo's playing his own instructor, and you can see there's a sequence there where he plays. They actually perform a sequence in a tea house from an opera, and Sammo plays the male, and Lam Ching-ying plays the female role. He was a prolific kung fu fighter and stuntman in movies at Shaw's and then later at Golden Harvest. And as I mentioned earlier, Sammo was really looking for a role that would define him. And he did indeed come up with the produce Mr. Vampire, which would really Lam Ching became synonymous with the Mr. Vampire series. But also, I think the finest role of his career would have, at least of action movies, was his performance in Prodigal Son with Yuen Biao, which is a terrific role. But Mr. Vampire really defined him as I mentioned earlier, he's like the Peter Cushing of Asia. It was who you're going to call. You're going to call Lam Ching Ying. And he was the vampire buster in several fairly mediocre sequels to Mr. Vampire and numerous spin-off films, including Magic Cop, which was like a modern-day version in which his character is like brought right into the modern era. He was a good actor's actor. I mean, he could actually genuinely play straight roles, and unfortunately was not really given that much of an opportunity to do so because he was famous for playing the guy with the funky eyebrows who was out there fighting vampires. But if you see Ringo Lam's very controversial film School on Fire, I say very controversial because it was banned in most Asian territories either before or shortly after its release. But if you see him in that movie, Lam Ching has a really nice role in there as a cop, as a straight role as a cop, and he quits himself very well. And as I was just mentioning, I mean, they did do the English language American version of Mr. Vampire, Demon Hunters, and for whatever reason, Lam Ching was never used in that. And he died of cancer a few years ago, which was a real shock. I remember seeing Sammo, not in person, but on TV at the funeral. And he was stunned because, I mean, Lam Ching Ying was somebody who didn't really... he was a very interesting character. I mean, on screen, he's normally playing these very cool... collected people, but off camera he could be quite boisterous. I mean, in the younger days they used to go out and have a few drinks, and he'd be the first one to get into a barroom brawl or what have you. But certainly when I met him, he was very soft-spoken and polite, and really had a wonderful career, and had never told anybody that he was ailing, and was working right up until the time of his demise. So I presume he had an illness whereby he pretty much could live his life up until the very end. And certainly my good friend Stefan Hammond eulogized him in the local press and said, I think the term he used was he was like a hero of this life and the next, as indeed he is, and has become a cult figure worldwide. This is the classic Cell set, I think, in all the movies of this era. And there's the condemned man's last meal. There's this guy's called Ban Ma-jai, the actor, Zebra. Ban Ma is Zebra Pan. And he was another member of the stunt team that worked with Bruce Lee and all the Bruce Lee movies, and then later went on to work with all the films of this era. He was always working in supporting roles like this. Obviously, he doesn't have the looks of a leading man, but he was doing stunts and playing roles. And he's also an action choreographer. And I worked with him on Circus Kids. And I have no idea why I guess it's relative to his real Chinese name, why he's called Ban Ma or Zebra, because he doesn't have any. You'd think maybe you'd have some kind of black and white disfiguring or something if you're going to call somebody zebra or zebra, but he does not. And this, you always see this the set here with the grass with the straw on the ground and the specific wooden bars. And I'm presuming that this is how cells actually looked in this period of Chinese history. And even if they didn't, that's how people think that they did, because they always have this exact same set in the movies from this era, and it's and indeed the exact same method of escaping from the cell that Sammo is about to employ, which is probably the most used device or plot contrivance in the history of action cinema. Is a guy gets locked into a cell and then pretends to be sick, and then when the jailer comes in to find out what the matter is, hits him over the head and makes a getaway. And I mean, if you've seen that once, you've seen it 10,000 times. At least in Shanghai Noon, they make reference to that, and they came up with a really clever way to get them out of a cell. And I was just working on the movie Highbinders with Jackie Chan and Lee Evans in Ireland, and we also had them in a cell in one scene. And you have the challenge of how do you get somebody out of a cell without resorting to, oh my God, my stomach hurts. And here even it's not going to work for Sammo either. So he's like, even at this stage, you couldn't use that to good effect to make your escape. Sammo, his characters in the film, he always has to strike this balance between somebody who's the underdog and the simpleton, with somebody with obviously his incredible physical prowess, and he really plays it quite well. And here's a good example of that, where you see these fellas think that he's getting himself beat up by the guards, and actually the reverse is happening, and he's going to make his escape. It's really quite a technical exercise that they can have that shoe attached to the back of his jacket for the whole movie, because you notice there's always these things like they use duct tape to keep Sammo's pants up. I mean, that's enough of an accomplishment, let alone that you've got to have a shoe tied to the back of his jacket. And one thing about Sammo in action when he's fighting in a movie is that you never have any doubt, or I don't anyway, that if you were standing there where the stuntman or the guy on the receiving end is standing and he hit you, you would fall down, you would get knocked out. I mean, the one element to Sammo's, obviously he has this incredible physicality and gymnastic skill from his days in the opera, but one element that he brings to it that not all of those guys have is power, that he's probably one of the most powerful fighters on screen. I remember watching a movie, somebody said to me, "Oh, you check out this film, you're going to see the real stick fighting." I won't mention the guy's name, but he was like a real life, and a very good real life martial arts exponent and a master of very different styles of Filipino stick fighting. And I watched the film, and even though technically, classically, the movements were correct, it was not the best you'd ever see. It didn't look powerful on screen. And I said to this person, I said, you know what, you definitely have the real ability in the real world, but film is different. If you want to see the stick on film, you should look at Skinny Tiger, Fatty Dragon, or take a look at the scene in Shanghai Express when Sammo comes out the front of the hotel with these two sticks and just slam bang. That is the stick on screen. This is a wonderful comic sequence. This rotted corpse, and I think it's Wu Ma actually under all the makeup, because if you look at the face closely, obviously the part's uncredited, and I asked Sammo, and hell, he couldn't remember. I mean, hell, he's only done like 200 movies, but I think maybe it's Wu Ma under the makeup. There's something about the way he moves and acts, because it's more of an acting than an action role, because they don't actually have this particular rotting corpse doing anything spectacular. This one's not actually dressed in the Mandarin robe, so this is obviously a pauper's grave, a rundown form, a burnt down crematorium, or not crematorium, but like a place where corpses and coffins are stored. And here we really see courageous Zheng. I mean, would you lie down and sleep next to a badly decayed corpse? I mean, I think I'd be out in the woods rather than lying there. And this is another example of another of Sammo's great strengths as a filmmaker, is that he has a great sense for visual comedy, for silent comedy. And this sequence is not obviously an action film sequence that we're going to see, but it refers back to this idea that in Chinese culture that you can be in a situation where your spirit energy is used to reanimate a dead body. And we saw the serious version of that earlier, well, the semi-serious version of it, with the evil wizard animating the vampire that was going to fight with Sammo. And now we have this sequence here where Sammo's in like a dream state, and from this physical contact with the corpse, his spirit reanimates the body. This disgusting, rotting, worm-infested corpse. I mean, this is obviously very primitive makeup, but it's actually quite effective in that you look at it and you just get, I would not sleep next to a creature that looked quite like this. And now you have this game of follow the leader, as Simon says, where this rotting corpse, this really is more of a zombie than a vampire, because he doesn't even behave like the hopping zombie that we saw earlier, because I guess this corpse has not been prepared in the same manner that the Kung Si would be. So he's following Sammo's every move. I always admire Sammo's ability to look at elements of society or elements of culture and then find imaginative ways to reinterpret them. And also the use of camera. I mean, these overhead shots are really nice to establish the physical relationship between the two figures. And he's somebody who You can't really say enough about his ability in terms of every aspect of filmmaking, whether it's conceiving a new concept, finding new talent, choreographing the action, supervising the cinematography of the films in which he's involved. And when I look back at many of the movies that he's credited on, the Golden Harvest films, I mean, he seems to be credited on every Golden Harvest movie or action. Even the comedies of this era, he gets a credit as action coordinator. You really wonder how much influence he had. Because please bear in mind that in Hong Kong during this era, if you had a movie with action scenes, when the action director came on the set, the main unit director, the director of credit, would maybe not even be there. And it's constantly been a problem in Hong Kong film history that at the end of the day, when the editor was cutting the movie together, you'd have scenes shot by the first unit director and scenes shot by the action unit, and they wouldn't necessarily match up. And now this great reaction shot here from courageous Zheng as he realizes that he's inadvertently brought this decaying creature back to life. And the sight gag that follows always gets a big laugh. And it's again another example of how if you can make your humour visual, then you can cross over into different markets. And that's one reason that people like Sammo and Jackie, who are really essentially physical comedians, have travelled in the way that Michael Hoy did not travel. I mean, Michael Hoy was a huge comic star in Asia, kind of a predecessor of Stephen Chow Sing-chi, and he didn't travel basically because so much of his humour was really based on verbal humour, which is, obviously for Western audiences, the Cantonese plays on words would not travel. And to a certain extent, Stephen Chow Sing-chi, has had the same problem. Just now, his film Shaolin Soccer, Siulam Juk Tao, which is a very visual film, has been picked up by Miramax, and I hope it will give him a chance to get into the overseas market. This always gets a big laugh. Here he goes. He's thrown it. He looked, boom, great timing, and then down, and it's got that punchline. That is something. I think probably a rotting corpse hitting the leading man on the head and in the groin with a brick is something that you will not see in a American horror movie anytime soon. And I can't believe he's prepared now still to lie down next to the reanimated corpse. And the black cat, and this means trouble. A black cat coming across your path has a different connotation. You notice, actually, if you look at the facial construction, there's a different guy in the zombie outfit as soon as after the black cat goes past, because now he is doing action. So if it was indeed Wu Ma, as I believe it was, playing the zombie in the early scene, this is actually quite nice, the way that they set this up, the movement, the sense of movement through the wood, and the way that they introduce the Lam Ching Ying character at the end of the trail, because there's actually not much ground covered, but a terrific sense of movement, and I like the reaction. And Lam Ching Ying's playing of the whole character, this kind of super cool crime inspector who is actually in front of his men and must never lose face, but in reality is not really prepared to deal with the kind of supernatural creatures that he's encountering in this neighborhood. So Sam are barreling towards him, and great editing here to set the scene up. Pulls out the double swords, boom, 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 boom. Timing, cut back, there's the movement, real sense of motion, and they're looking, they see the zombie before their leader does. They're like, we're out of here. Boom, they're back. And he's like, what the hell's with you guys? He's the guy who's not caught up with the plot. And boom, cheek to cheek with the dead man walking. And it's the comic flair of that character is a lot of fun to watch, and makes us realise what a lost Lam Ching Ying was to Hong Kong action cinema. Because not only was he a terrific martial arts exponent, as we get to see a little bit of that in this film, but he's also a fine actor to boot. And never better than when he's directed by Sammo. Like many people from this era, I mean, they just did never look as good as when Sammo Hung was directing them. Speaking of Sammo's discoveries, Yun Bu was actually one of the stunt team on this movie, one of the action choreographers, and he did some stunt doubling and also helping choreograph the action scenes. And people always ask about that, how when they hire an action choreographer from Hong Kong, why there's always a team of 4 or 5 guys with them. Why doesn't the choreographer just come in and use if he's working in the overseas market, maybe he would use just the local stuntmen. And the way it works in Hong Kong is that the team would actually bounce ideas back and forward with the action coordinator and would be needed to actually demonstrate the movements for the actors involved. And so you always had to have, in order to construct these kind of three-dimensional action sequences that you need in a Hong Kong style action film, you need a group of people, maybe 5 people, which would be an ideal lineup of stuntmen with various physical attributes to help choreograph the sequence with the coordinator. And the coordinator himself couldn't just come up as one person on the set. And that's why you always have, like, with Yuen Woo-ping, you had all his brothers, the Yuen Ga band, because they can bounce ideas back around each other. And that's how they get to be better than, a person working by themselves. This location, interesting to see these two guys in this location. This is the exact same location, at least in terms of structure and shape, as the what do you call it? The morgue, or the place where bodies are stored in Magnificent Butcher, where there's a fight sequence between those two people, between Sammo Hung and Zhong Fat, and the layout is exactly the same. And it is indeed the same set as they fight in that movie. And here they are playing very different characters in Spooky Encounters. In that movie, the character Chong Fat played is like this mad cat-style fighting martial arts hitman, and Sammo is Lam Sai-wing. This is another chance for us to see the great comic timing of Lam Ching-ying, because Sammo will always look as a director for the twist to the character. Like in the case of Chong Fat, you got this guy who, even though he is good-hearted, even though he's actually a good wizard, is highly eccentric and off the wall and slightly screwball. And then at the same time, you've got this guy played by Lam Ching-ying, who could be just a regular tight-ass, by-the-book police inspector of this era. But actually, we managed to see that he's actually playing to his subordinate officers this role of being this completely fearless and totally this guy who knows no fear, who whatever obstacle they're scared of, he can face it resolutely. And here we have this sequence where they're meant to go and check a coffin and actually open up and look at the dead body inside. And these 4 guys actually have the real proper reaction that any sane person should have about opening up a Chinese coffin and looking at a decaying corpse. And it's an example of Sammo's comic timing there as he sets it up, and then we're ready to see this horrific sight inside the coffin. Of course, the audience knows that Sammo's hiding inside, but he's setting it up. And I just think this is inspired, because now the police inspectors, he can't not open the coffin lid, but at the same time, the last thing he wants to do is to look at or smell this supposedly decaying body inside. So you have this wonderful sight gag. And again, it's something that travels very well, always gets a big laugh. And I've seen the film play different audiences around the world, and compared to the rather tame response it got at Cannes, it's now become a cult favorite and plays very well. Something I learned, as I mentioned earlier, when I showed scenes from it to the Asia Society. And there's a certain house style to the Golden Harvest films of this era, partly because they used a rotating cast in front of and behind the camera. They had a really limited talent pool of performers and cinematographers and lighting men and all the technical crew. But also they always had very limited space at Golden Harvest in terms of the sound stages. I mean, soundstage is kind of a misnomer because they've hardly ever recorded sound in the films that were made there during the 70s and the 80s, and so you tended to see the same, but you tended to see the same configuration again and again because there was limited space and limited time to redress the sets. So some fairly minimal redressing went on from one film to the other, and so that's why if you see a lot of these films, as I have, for my sins, you tend to know which studio is which and which films were being shot back to back by the fact that you're seeing the same sets. The Shoe makes its reappearance, and here we are actually out in the new territories in Hong Kong. Something I should mention, that you get this impression from watching films that Hong Kong is a complete, urban jungle. And in reality, there is an amazing amount of countryside up towards the new territories, towards China. In Hong Kong movies of this era, you always see two kinds of tea houses. There is the urban tea house, which is in the built-up area in the town or city of the period, and that basically serves the tradesmen and the people living there. And you get this kind of tea house, which is out in the countryside, and it's really, I would say, slightly lower class, and it's for the workers, for the field workers, for people who are working in the countryside and didn't have the time or the energy to go into town. So somebody would set up a tea house out there in the sticks. And the one thing that's true of the tea house in town or the tea house in the country in a kung fu movie is there will be a fight. Nobody goes there just to have tea. And kung fu films had kind of fallen from favor at the time Sammo made Spooky Encounters 2. And there's a great line when they actually have a tea house that's similar to the old tea houses in the old town tea houses of these films. And somebody says, "Hey, back in business, business is brisk." That having not been a tea house fight for a long time, even though it was had been a staple of kung fu cinema. And here's our Evil Dead moment. People always make a lot of this, hey, Sam Raimi or so-and-so, they took this idea. Now, I don't know if Sam Raimi had even seen Spooky Encounters before he made Evil Dead 2, and, he had Bruce Campbell's his arm becoming possessed and having a life of its own. But he's a big Hong Kong film fan. It's possible that he did. I don't see anything wrong with him taking that idea and reinterpreting it in a totally new concept. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Sammo certainly had taken ideas and still takes ideas and reinterprets them in his own way. His movie, the Skinny Tiger, Fatty Dragon, beat for beat was the movie Running Scared. So in terms of its plot structure. And this is constantly been the case that Hong Kong filmmakers have looked to the West and elsewhere and to Japan for fresh ideas and then reinterpreted them in their own unique manner, and that's become Hong Kong cinema. So I don't have any problem with American filmmakers borrowing elements of increasingly this is happening, Hong Kong filmmakers, Hollywood filmmakers borrowing elements from Hong Kong action films. But it's certainly huge fun, the whole possessed hand sequence that we see here. And another chance to see another aspect of Taoism, which is the creation of these scarecrows. And this is their version of the voodoo doll, which has become this kind of. I think anybody takes voodoo dolls very seriously now. It's kind of hokey, but in this movie, he's used this voodoo practice, this kind of the Taoist equivalent of voodoo, to possess Sammo's hand and set up that whole action sequence in the tea house. Now we have a throwdown between these two guys with the use of the swords, and they are real brothers. But it's like the old Star Wars thing. One of them's chosen the bright side of the Force, and one of them has chosen the dark side. So you get a chance for them, and of course they're handy stunt doubles. Who occasionally one of them is Yuen Bu to show their stuff, and the physical clash of these wooden swords. Spooky Encounters is interesting among films of this genre in that they really give so much time and energy and focus to the martial arts. Because many of the subsequent films, for example, the Mr. Vampire series, the martial arts were really to the background, and the whole thing was the focus was on comedy and the supernatural, various aspects of the supernatural. But here, Sammo quite rightly strikes a balance between the horror element, if you can call it horror, but the supernatural element, and the fact that you can have slam bang. It gives an excuse for really amazing slam bang martial arts fight sequences, and it's a good mix. And I think the reason why they maybe would say otherwise, but the reason why a lot of Hong Kong filmmakers and even American filmmakers shy away from doing long, complicated action scenes in favor of comedy or horror or special effects is that those things are easier to do. That actually to execute a long, complicated martial arts sequence is actually one of the most difficult accomplishments of filmmaking. And people worldwide, it always amazes me, people looking down their nose at Hong Kong action filmmaking, because I think most Hong Kong action filmmakers, if given two people sitting around a kitchen table and they've got to shoot a dramatic sequence, could shoot a pretty good dramatic scene. Whether a dramatic director or drama director could shoot Hong Kong style martial arts action scenes is another question altogether, and I would dare to suggest that most cannot. This is, I think, one of the high points of Sammo's career as a screen fighter. And for people who are not really familiar with his work, people always say to me, "Oh, it's amazing, a big guy like that moving like he does." But of course, the saving grace of Sammo is the fact that he had learned many of these physical movements when he was built more regular size, when he was a youngster, when he was thinner in his younger days. And then for whatever reason, his genetic predisposition, he had an injury that meant that he couldn't train for a while, and he loves to eat. He gained a lot of weight, but he already had the physical prowess, and he never really stopped doing all the stuff that he could do. As he gained weight, he just kind of like adjusted his movements accordingly. And so this sequence was featured quite prominently in the Best of Martial Arts documentary, and a lot of people like saying, "Geez, this is incredible to see a guy moving as Sammo does here, and to see him use the bench with this kind of timing, and it's just great." I mean, people said to me, when he did martial law, "I love this. There's a punch coming up here, boom." And it's like what makes it more powerful is the fact that the way he looks down the length of the arm when he's hitting. But we were talking about stunt. I mean, when he went to do martial law, people said, "Geez, will it work in America?" And I'm like, "Of course it will, because all the good old boys in America, or most of the guys in America who fight or think they can, who are your audience, they have the big old beer gut, and they look like Sammo Hung." Love that moment. Boom, it goes down there, it punctuates the scene, and he's somebody who really. He is the American dream made real. This kind of big, burly Chinese guy who came to America and became a star on American television. But I certainly had every confidence that he would and could break into the American market if given the right vehicle. Now, of course, I mean, Sammo's more focused on being a director, and I think, he can probably enjoy even more success internationally as a filmmaker than he can as an action star. Here's Chung Fat's character coming to the rescue of Sammo, and another chance for Sammo to play with the character played by Lam Ching-ying, where even though he's kind of the straight man, we see he's normally the joke is on him, as these smaller versions of these voodoo dolls are brought in and used to possess the four lieutenants. Quick chance here to see the beautiful, crisp movements of Lam Ching-ying, and a taste of his role, of why he would be cast as Leng Yitai in Prodigal Son, Bai Ga Zhai, some years later. He has a wonderful fluidity to his movement. But here is his character. Look how, it must have been hot, look at how fast the robe changes colour. That's something you can see that the stuntmen and martial arts actors really suffered when they shot both on the un-air-conditioned backlot at Golden Harvest, and indeed in the exterior. And there's this nice touch here. His ponytail comes adrift, and that kind of highlights the fact that he's up against it as he's fighting his own men. And it was and is extremely difficult to film action scenes in Hong Kong for that reason, because of the humidity, but specifically in certain times of the year. It's incredibly hot, and you can see in the films that people start off with clean costumes, and then within a few movements they're absolutely dripping wet. And there's nothing you can do about that, because, I mean, that's just the nature of the environment. The good thing about it is I think people pull their muscles less often than perhaps they would if we were doing these films in England, because they have the muscles stay looser and warmer, because it's very rarely very cold when they're shooting Hong Kong action films. Talking some more about the mythology of Hong Kong, Hong Kong, the legends of Hong Kong folklore. The position in which somebody's coffin is buried is also a very important aspect of ensuring future fortune for the family. And there's actually a whole film devoted to that, which was Bury Me High, which was directed by and co-starring Choi Siu-ming, who's a terrific director who never really came into his own. He's made some very interesting films, but that's probably the best. It was a modern-day movie that was very highly regarded. And then he was going to direct a movie, I think Fireman Story, with Jackie Chan, and didn't happen. But the whole premise of Bury Me High is that the position at which someone's ancestors are buried has a direct relevance to how their descendants prosper or do not prosper in the contemporary era. And now we have another sequence upcoming, which is an example of this kind of transference of images and ideas between cultures. And again, it's very easy to look at Hong Kong films and find scenes and then find equivalent scenes in Hollywood productions and point the finger and say, oh, somebody saw a Hong Kong film and borrowed this. I mean, first of all, I don't have any problem with it on ethical grounds, because I think that, as the old saying goes, all filmmakers steal, and great filmmakers steal from the best. But also, I think on purely pragmatic grounds, filmmakers for a long time could have felt complete freedom to borrow elements from Hong Kong films, because nobody would see those movies. And this whole thing here with Sammo being painted with calligraphy to help him ward off the evil forces seems to me to be visually very similar to the scene in Conan the Barbarian when, before the final battle, Arnold Schwarzenegger has this calligraphy painted onto him. Actually, it's to restore him from life to life after he's been killed and the demons are coming for him. But the imagery is very similar to this, and it could be two people inventing the wheel, but I just thought I'd mention that. And again, I certainly don't see anything wrong with it. But I don't think anybody imagined in any time of the recent history of Hong Kong film that so much time and effort would be taken as is taken at Hong Kong Legends, where these movies from 20 or even 30 years ago are lovingly restored and brought back into the mass market. And for quite a long time, it was fair game. If you found a sequence that you could borrow from a Hong Kong action film, you could certainly do what you wanted with it, because the chances are that outside of that the lunatic fringe like myself, the very few Western fans of this kind of film, that it was not going to get any kind of mainstream release. Now, of course, these films are selling incredibly well on DVD and available in high street stores, so it's become increasingly apparent how these films have been mined by Hollywood action filmmakers over the years. Here we see some more of the tricks of the trade for these Taoist masters. Just to talk about some of the weapons that we see here, one reoccurring implement used by Taoist masters in reality and in Hong Kong films is the eight-sided mirror, or the bagua, which also appears in the film Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, and you see it in many houses today and places of work in Hong Kong. Basically, the bagua mirror is there to repel evil. The eight sides represent, respectively, sky, earth, water, fire, thunder, wind, mountain, and lake. These different elemental forces. And the eight sides are meant to gather the power of those forces in order to repel evil. And Taoism basically is really all about using nature to contend with supernature and affecting a balance. Basically, if people live the Taoist way, that they would be balanced in their lives. And you also get to see the use of the coin sword, which is another will be familiar to anybody who lives in Hong Kong and is familiar with Taoism, and also very familiar to anybody who watches a significant number of these films, because the coin sword, a sword made up of coins, is a weapon used by the Taoist master for the banishing of ghosts. And even today, I mean, there are cases. I mean, I had an instance a few years ago where there was a property that seemed to be haunted, and finding somebody who was skilled in this specific skill for the banishment of ghosts. And it's quite a pragmatic and practical matter. And in Chinese circles, nobody really thinks that there's anything really unusual in a general sense about somebody coming in and saying, you know what, your house has a ghost in it, we're going to send for our version of a Ghostbuster, and they're then going to drive the spirit out using the various implements at their disposal. And that happens to this day, and I think, as I mentioned before, even though Hong Kong is a very high-tech society, people do genuinely believe in the supernatural. And so these films, one reason I think that they've endured as they have is that the Hong Kong supernatural movies actually play to a very deep-seated part of the Chinese psyche, which regards this as a genuine aspect of life. And so because it's constantly there in the real world, it's something that's constantly reflected on the screen. And here we have early the use of this wire sequence here to introduce these three rather hokey-looking killer zombie creatures. And the mirror comes out with the eight-sided mirror, and very early use of special effects. It's been said, and rightly so, that most of the Hong Kong movies of this era, the special effects were the performers themselves. And even though they're like master and student in the film, this is actually the only time in the picture we see Zhong Fat and Sammo Hung fighting side by side and joining forces against these supernaturally enhanced assassins. And they actually have pretty good timing together. So, of course, Zhong Fat was somebody who was prolific in this era, in this period, as somebody who was very good at doing martial arts action fight sequences. So you can see him in many of Sammo's films and many of the films, even like little cameos. If you look at Knockabout, the Sammo's first film that really gave Yun Bu an acting role, he turns up at the very end of the film just with a walk-on. And so, I mean, he was somebody who was being used for major fighting roles and just as a supporting player. And is still active on the scene today. I mean, like many of his brethren from this era, because now they're really not doing Chinese martial art pictures with the same kind of volume and the same style as in this era. A lot of the guys are working as character actors. Now, this is the something that everybody always remembers about the movie. If they remember nothing else about the mythology, or rather the supernatural aspects of Hong Kong or China, is the fact that the one thing you learn about this film is you have to have the taller altar. The higher the altar, the more power that you have. And I remember when we were doing Highbinders in Dublin, talking to our playback monitor supervisor, and he was describing to me this film that he'd seen, and he hadn't realized that, you know, it was Sammo, who we were working with on Highbinders, had been the star and director of this film. And he described it to me, and immediately I knew which film it was, because he says there's a fight at the end between these two wizards, and they have to get the altar higher, and the higher the altar, the more power they have. And so as soon as he said that, I knew he was talking about Spooky Encounters, because it's something everybody remembers from this finale. And we now have this, the kind of, this is the equivalent of the gunfight in the OK Corral for these guys. This is like pistols in high noon, and a terrific chance to show this unique aspect of like Hong Kong culture, like the dead chickens coming off the side there, and Sammo cranking up the altar. And so the higher you go, the closer to heaven, the more power you have. And look at the incense he's got burning there. He's a fire hazard. So the object here is to use their disciples as human weapons. So this is the first time that we're really seeing what we would say sanda expressed in the film. Sanda being spirit boxing, which is the summoning of spirits to help somebody in battle. And normally it's the practitioner themselves will summon spirits, and they themselves become possessed, and they themselves go into action. But there's another version where you can kind of fight by proxy, and so they summon a spirit to possess another person. So in this case, Zhong Fat is going to summon spirits to possess Sammo, and Chan Lung is going to summon spirits to possess the members of his group, who have whatever skills in real life. They don't really have martial arts skills in real world, but they do have skills when they're possessed by specific spirits. Another example there of the early use of special effects in a Hong Kong action picture, in a Golden Harvest martial arts picture. They really, special effects, physical effects have become more defined over the years. Visual effects really came into their own, I would say, really as late in the day as Storm Riders. I mean, Zoo Warriors, Suk San, Choi Hark's film, in which Sammo Hung appears, is really all about physical effects. I mean, most of what you see that's really memorable on that film was created physically on the set, using wires and all the physical abilities of the stunt performers. Whereas when you see Storm Riders, really the martial arts is in the background. And this figure that he's picking up now is actually a representation of the Monkey King of San Gong. And this is going to be the first of the characters that is summoned by Zhong Fat to possess Sammo Hung. And at the same time, Chan Lung is summoning the spirit of Na Cha, who is like a little boy with a hoop, who is another creature from Chinese mythology. So we'll talk about the Monkey King first. I mean, obviously, I think people now are very familiar with Journey to the West. There was actually a pretty average Hallmark film, The Lost Kingdom, in which Russell Wong played the Monkey King, who's known in Chinese as Chai Tin Dai Zeng, or in an more old-fashioned way, you call him Hong Xing Ye. But Journey to the West, Sayagai, is like this famous classic tome, famous classic fantasy about the bringing of the Buddhist scriptures to the West, from basically from India to China. And one of the characters involved is the monkey. And here we see Sammo's possessed by the monkey god and is demonstrating the fighting techniques of a monkey. And it's an amazing performance and one of his most memorable fight sequences. And the guy he's fighting is possessed by Na Cha, who's is the son of one of the 4 heavenly kings, the Sai Dai Tin Wong. And Na Cha is the son of Lei Ching. And this character was seen in a lot of the old black and white fantasy movies, and actually in a movie called Na Cha, which was one of the, I think it maybe was the very first starring role of Alexander Fu Seng at Shaw Brothers. But again, it's a Shaw Brothers movie, so no one's really seen it for a long time. But Fu Seng actually played that character. But here we see these gods being brought down into human form and with their specific abilities. And Na Cha's weapon of choice is this hoop. It's kind of an early version of that thing that Xena, the warrior princess, throws around, I think. And again, we can say maybe Sam Raimi was in part inspired by this movie. And it's part of the fun of this finale is to allow these players to play totally different characters because they're now possessed. And Sammo, I remember it was really funny because we were, again, referring to, we were in Highbinders, we had a press conference to talk about the film, and Jackie Chan was talking about Sammo Hung, and, he says, look at Sammo, he's like built like an elephant, but he moves like a monkey. I think probably only Jackie can get away with saying that, but certainly in this sequence, that's certainly borne out. You have a guy who really is built more like an elephant, but can move like a monkey. And actually, Jackie, even though he did a movie in a Snake in the Snake in the Eagle's Shadow, or he has done films where he's played a monkey-type character, he's never really shown monkey boxing in the way that Sammo does. Probably because Sammo did it quite early on, like in 1980 in this film. So there was a sense of, okay, well, you don't want to copy that. So actually, you don't often see monkey boxing in the films. There is a very strong tradition of monkey kung fu in Hong Kong, and actually one of the most unlikely exponents of that is Anthony Wong Chao San, who's more famous for chopping up people and playing serial killer roles, but actually is a very serious kung fu devotee and is an expert of the Pekwa monkey kung fu style. And one of his elder kung fu brothers is Chen Quan Tai, who was one of the leading lights at the Shaw Brothers in the early era of Shaw Brothers martial arts heroes. And he normally was cast as a practitioner of Hung Gar or some other southern Chinese kung fu system. But actually Chen Quan Tai, who was like, I think, the middleweight martial arts champion of Asia, and had been a fireman, but his main martial arts style was monkey kung fu. And now we get a chance to see Ha Wong show his stuff. And this is a great sequence, and it's probably the best straight fight sequence that he's ever got to do in a film. And he always, he's never, you look at him physically, Ha Wong doesn't really look the part. He doesn't look like a youthful, athletic martial arts master, but he really does have the genuine skills, and was training from a very young age, and was discovered and asked to work in kung fu movies. And now another spirit being summoned to possess the spirit of Sammo, and this is like Miss Ho, the same character as a Chinese goddess or a female immortal who has like a Princess Leia hairstyle. And you often see pictures of like the Chinese immortals, and they will include Na Cha with his golden hoop, and this Miss Ho with a straight sword. And this Sammo now coming in as a spear-playing female immortal, and it's incredible to watch the timing here. The red vest is actually a female undergarment that was worn in those times. Obviously, nowadays people wouldn't find this very stunning, but in the old times, even if you saw the red vest, it was really quite shocking. So this is like a shield, because anything that's remotely sexual or sensual is like poison to spiritual beings. So this is actually a protective garb that Sam was wearing for this scene. But I love this the timing of this sequence, and seeing Sammo with any weapon. I mean, Sammo really is probably the greatest on-screen exponent of weaponry. And if you see him in Odd Couple, which is the film fans always cite as his finest hour, but this is probably this is his second finest hour if you take Odd Couple to be the best that he was going to be. Kind of tricky to do because you've got the straight sword, which is a close to medium range weapon, and the spear, which is a long range weapon. So it's tricky to choreograph because you actually have to keep the spear player within sword distance. But Sammo does that. I mean, that's one thing that came from the opera, is that unlike the Western opera, which is guys, big guys who kind of shaped like Sammo, standing there singing, in the opera they always had implements, weapons, sequences, scenes when spears were being flipped back and forward across the stage with great dexterity. So this was not really allied to a specific martial arts style, but it gave people a real sense of like the timings and the dynamics of using weapons in a spectacular manner. So people always ask, what style of spear play is that? I don't know that it's generically it's a specific style, but it really reflects the fact that Sammo has developed an ability to feel the dynamic of a weapon on screen and to move it in such a way that it will work visually. And it doesn't really matter whether this is a movement that can be used in real life, because this isn't real life, it's a movie. And now we have the return of the shoe, and the payoff for this bit of footwear that Sammo's been carrying. And I love that. He says throw a shoe, and he throws the one from his foot. Finally, he throws the real one. And of course, because it has about it the scent or the spirit sense of Master Tam, because it's his shoe, it can be used much akin to like a totem in Chinese black magic. So when he stuffs the needle through, you have this kind of gunshot effect of something going through the foot. And, you really, people really don't have a much harder time than they do in a Sammo Hung movie. I mean, that's a pretty painful effect, and the spirit leaves him. And now he's going to get his comeuppance. And this real sense of rage from Sammo's character, as this guy has ruined his life and had an affair with his wife, and so now he gets run through with his own straight sword. And now the final showdown between the two dueling wizards, these two brothers. And this is great. Fire comes across, and then he opens up his shirt to deflect the flames. Actually quite a neat stunt. I mean, that's not a dummy. That's a real guy standing there and doing a fire gag. And those days, they didn't really have access to the flame-resistant gel and the other attributes that people had in the West in terms of fire gags. So it was pretty risky. And in the early days of Hong Kong film, people did get burnt doing fire stunts, which, as ever with Hong Kong, didn't stop them from trying again and trying again. So we have this fire gag here at the ending, which is shot in the exterior section of the back lot at Golden Harvest. I think you'd have a hard time doing this as an interior shot, even in Hong Kong. Sammo diving out of the way, and the Sammo now finding a twist and an unexpected edge to the finale, because obviously we know that Chan Lung's character as the main villain, or at least the tool of the main villain, is going to get his comeuppance. And a pretty neat stunt there, the guy going off the flaming flip-flop down to the ground, and then a cut. And as I say, it wasn't really common to see fire gags at this time in Hong Kong film. So, as ever, Sammo breaking new ground, showing this kind of action. And there's enough shots here where you can actually see that it was Chan Lung himself who got burnt. And now, up on the other tower, we have this, the typical sardonic Sammo flair as he comes running forward. And of course you think, oh, he's going to catch him. And then he goes down and boom. You find out that there's actually maybe a downside to having the tallest altar in town. And he says, could you survive that? Boom. So it's this unique blend that Sammo has of bringing horror and comedy together. And now here comes the wife. And this is moment. I mean, people remember two things about this movie: the altar and this thing at the end. And out she comes, and you have this moment. You think, okay, fine, everybody else is dead. He's going to get back together with her, and they'll live happily ever after. And then it's like, I don't know why it shouldn't work, and it's horrible. I mean, the fact that he's going to react the way he does. But within the context of this exaggerated piece, it kind of works. And she has caused enough death and destruction. But I don't think, there's ever been a scene ever in action cinema where somebody's wife was dealt with like that for the finale. Well, that's been a riot. An odd ending, but a fantastic movie. And thank you for watching Spooky Encounters with me, Bey Logan. Thank you. Goodbye.